What word or phrase did you totally misunderstand as a child? Story 1. When I was young, my father said to me, knowledge is power. Francis Bacon. I understood it as knowledge is power. Francis Bacon. For more than a decade, I wondered over the meaning of the second part, and what was the surreal linkage between the two. If I said the quote to someone, knowledge is power, Francis Bacon, they nodded knowingly. Or someone might say, knowledge is power, and ID finished the quote Francis Bacon, and they wouldn't look at me like ID said something very odd, but thoughtfully agree. I did ask a teacher, what did knowledge is power, Francis Bacon mean, and got a full 10-minute explanation of the knowledge is power bit, but nothing on Francis Bacon. When I prompted further explanation by saying Francis Bacon in a questioning tone, I just got a yes. At 12, I didn't have the confidence to press it further. I just accepted it as something I'd never understand. It wasn't until years later I saw it written down that the penny dropped. Story 2, a story from when I was in 6th grade. I moved to the U.S. from Panama when I was in 4th grade, so by the time I was a 6th grader, I was pretty good with English. I was also born in England, and communicating with the students, I spoke perfectly but still didn't know a lot of the colloquialisms and common phrases. One day, while in math class, this one kid stood up and went to the bathroom. Our classrooms had bathrooms inside him for some reason, as he would always do several times a day. As soon as he walked in and closed the door, the kids around me started to whisper to each other, John always goes to the bathroom. You know why? Huh? I heard he jacks off in there. What? Yeah, he never does the work anyway. Yeah, Cassie's jacking off. Wouldn't you, of course, from overhearing this conversation? I used the concept of context clues I had learned in school. Jacking off means to skip work and slack off. When the teacher came to the front and had noticed John had been gone for a good few minutes, she asked where he was out loud. OH, and another thing, I was the most face teacher's pet you could imagine, and there was no way I was going to pass the chance up to be the honest and noble student of the day. So I automatically yell out, I heard John jacks off in there. All of a sudden, I see 30 kids turn to me with shocked faces, and my teacher has a look of horror on hers. I instantly yell out, I don't know what that means, which already sounds like bullshit, which entails 30 kids all doing the masturbating motion to silently let me know the territory I'd gone into. Imagine the surprise when John came out of the bathroom as he witnessed 36 graders miming slow hand jobs in utter silence to a stunned Asian kid. Story 3, death sentence. I thought that the executioner actually spoke a sentence into your ear that killed you if you heard it. I figured that's why he wore a hood, so that no one could read his lips. Story 4, I always thought that Right Said Fred's song Him to Sexy was about his love for the number 264, 264, my shirt 264, my car 264, etc. Story 5, when I was little, I thought drinking and driving meant the physical act of drinking a beverage, not just alcohol. One day when I was 6, I told my mother not to drink and drive while she sipped a Diet Pepsi, and she just laughed at me. Story 6, for some reason, I thought the word sucker was a compliment. One time a lady at the bank gave me a lollipop, and I said, a sucker from a sucker, right, Mom? Story 7, I always thought euthanasia was youth in Asia and couldn't figure out why it was a big controversial issue. Yeah, there are kids living in Asia, so what? Story 8, when I was 10, my sister told me that my grandmother quit smoking cold turkey. It wasn't until high school when I embarrassed myself telling my friend to try eating cold turkey to help quit smoking that I knew what it really meant. Story 9, this actually continued up until fairly recently. I always thought to each his own was pronounced do-e, chuzo, and just assumed it was French or something. Story 10, LMNOP instead of LMNOP. I thought an LMNOP was a special version of the letter P. Also, I misunderstood the word death. After watching endless children's TV shows with a bad guy, said the good guys would suffer certain death, but they somehow managed to scrape by. I didn't know that death meant dying. I thought it meant in danger of dying or close to dying. Story 11, I thought excruciatingly meant extremely. I learned it from Pinky and the Brain, but didn't quite get the context, so for a few weeks there, apples were excruciatingly big, and candy was excruciatingly delicious. Story 12, I pronounced it Calvin and Hobbies until I was 12. I owned every book and read them daily. My family thought it was hilarious, so they never told me. Story 13, lactose intolerant, was lactose intolerance to me as a 5th grader. I assumed that lacking whatever toes was meant that you were a D-bag who doesn't like milk. Story 14, I only realized this one a few days ago. A rainy day fund is money you save up for when something goes wrong and you need some extra cash. I always thought a rainy day fund was money you saved up for when you were having a day and needed to go shopping to cheer yourself up. Story 15, around age 8, I read the word incident in a newspaper and decided it must be the opposite of accident. At school, I spent all of morning playtime running around stamping on feet. flicking noses and bumping into people, then saying in a very sarcastic tone, "Oh, sorry." It was an incident. Then at lunch break, everyone else was doing it too. My teacher tried to explain that I was wrong, but couldn't give much more information than it's not the opposite of accident. Later that year, I discovered the word patronizing and used it to correctly describe how some teachers treated me. So I think I broke even overall. Now I teach English, and I know almost all the words. And if I don't know, it'll work with the student, and we'll use our research skills to find the answer, whilst I hold back the tears as I remember the past. Story 16, Suicide. ID hear it whispered on TV and by adults, and thought they were saying suicide, which must have been a really bad neighborhood, which explained why nobody spoke openly about it. Story 17, Bullshit. I must have been pretty young, maybe 4 or 5, when I heard the term bullshit and interpreted it as bowl dash. I pictured a bowl of steamy. Thank you, Kenny Keach in the 3rd grade, for teaching me how to swear properly. Also the centerfolds. Story 18, my friend thought that Stevie Wonder's part-time lover was actually a apartheid lover. I had just learned about apartheid and was then pretty sure he wasn't right. Story 19, Jurassic. Thought it was pronounced Jurassic. Also, when we would pray before dinner, we would recite the old, God is good. God is great. Let us thank him for our food. And I would always say, God is good, God is great. Let us thank him for our food. A man kind of shows how religion is bullshit for kids. Story 20. I thought for a couple months when I was young that when you said it's 5:15, it meant 525. Since a quarter was 25 cents, I proceeded to use dime and nickel to reference time. Story 21. When I was little, I used to say all wrapped up like a stuffy leg Doug when my mom would wrap me in a towel after the bath. My parents had no idea where this phrase came from, although I repeated it for years. When I was about 16, we were cleaning out some from my room and flicking through bits and pieces nostalgically. I picked up what was one of my favorite picture books from when I was a toddler, a story about a tiger who got sick. One of his friends helped him bath, wrapped him in a big rug afterwards, and said all wrapped up in a spotted leopard rug. Mystery solved. Story 22, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, they will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our jelly bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forget those who trespass before us. Lead us not to temptation, but deliver us some evil. For why is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever? Amen actually makes more sense this way. Story 23, I was about 15 when I made the connection that drawers are what we call drawers, those things you put your socks in. It's a drawer I read quite a bit, and I was always wondering what the chest of drawers was, and assumed it was a place where people kept their pencils and stuff. Edit, I was my elementary school spelling bee champ, too. Go figure. Story 24, during a Catholic service, there's a part where the priest sings, "Let us proclaim the mystery of faith." When he sang it, the words always came out a little mumbly, which left me thinking he was saying, "Let us proclaim the mystery of fame." Years went by with me thinking this as I sat there many a Sunday, pondering how the people like Tom Cruise became so famous. In my defense, at least my version rhymed. Story 25, oh boy. For the longest time, when I was little, I used to think Jesus Christ was cheesy crust. I was pretty confused in church. It wasn't until halfway through 1st grade did I actually confront my mother about it and ask why they kept talking about toast. Story 26. I think that I was in high school before I realized that the Cadillac of something meant that it was the best. Up to that point, I thought that it meant that it sucks. Story 27. I would cry when I got punished and would tell my mother that I would try harder to have long, as she eventually told me that it was to behave and not be have. Story 28. About the time I could first read, I went to a restaurant with my family and was allowed to go to the bathroom by myself. I proceeded to take a massive 6 or 7-year-old. I was 6 or 7. Not the and saw something on the wall like call triple XXXXX to see me wet the... Not knowing what it was, I got all excited and ran out to my parents after cleaning up and told them about a number I wanted to call and explained to them why. It was then that I learned the slang term. Story 29. It did not occur to me that my mother was incorrectly using one of her favorite sayings all these years until she sent me an email indicating on a particularly warm day that it was hotter than Hades. As she was in Florida at the time, I pointed out that the temperature in the two locations was similar and that it was, in fact, slightly cooler in Haiti that day. Story 30. Okay, this one is really random, but I had kind of a visual misunderstanding as a kid. I didn't realize the old Postal Service logo was an eagle. I thought it was some weird stylized version of a postman facing left wearing a funny hat. Does anyone else see it? Not really sure why. And then one day I was just like, oh, it's an eagle. Story 31. Handicapped was the biggest word that I knew how to say. However, I didn't know the meaning of the word. When asked what do you want to be when you grow up, I would reply handicapped. I never understood why they laughed. Story 32, pulling your chain. A neighborhood kid's father confronted me once and told me he knew I had been pulling my son's chain and he wanted me to stop. I had no idea what he meant, and my first thought was that he meant I was pulling his son's bike chain, which was just ridiculous to me. I denied doing anything to his chain and rode off on my bike. It wasn't until I was a late teen or even early adult that I found out what that phrase meant. With my newfound knowledge, I can say that yes, I had pulled his son's chain. Story 33. I was about 6 in 1987 when the stock market crashed. All anyone in my family would talk about was the stock market crash. I envisioned a catastrophe in which a supermarket which sold stock pieces of paper of some sort in my mind had been situated on a cliff in New York and had fallen in a landslide, crashing to the ground below. I was very upset about the foolishness that must have been involved in building this market on the edge of a cliff. One day, I went to my dad and asked him how many people died in the stock market crash. He thought I was being very deep and pointing out to him that he should not be so worried about something as silly as money, so long as we were all alive and healthy. What I really wanted to know was how many stock shoppers had fallen when the store plummeted over the edge of the cliff. Story 34. Well, in junior school, I asked the teacher what it was. I thought meant organism. I had no idea what it was at the time. Kids in the class kept telling me to ask the teacher what it was, so I did. Eventually, I figured it probably had something to do with, but I kept asking anyway because everyone was laughing. Kids. Teacher took it quite well. We had a good teacher who didn't take jokes too seriously. LOL. Story 35. Drinking and driving. I remember freaking out anytime my mom would have water or a soda in the car and would take a sip while driving. I thought for sure we were going to get pulled over and arrested when I was 6-ish. Story 36. When I was a child, flick a person off, I was given a hard time for that, and I stand by my 9-year-old self. Flipping with your hands is even like a flicking motion, kind of. Story 37. I thought worship was worship, and my imagination ran wild with thoughts of an epic battle raging for an hour, and then everyone went home and relaxed the rest of their Sundays. Such was not the case. Story 38. I misunderstood every sign and commercial that had a message of don't drink if you're underage or don't drink and drive. I was always thinking WTF is so wrong with drinking. I love to drink chocolate milk and soda and water. Why am I not supposed to drink it? Somehow I still think this phrase is way too ambiguous. Story 39. When I was a kid in the 3rd grade, I was playing duck, duck, goose in the schoolyard. I was it and figured that I would try to be clever this round and fake people out. I tried to stutter fake or to mesh words, so I happened to be picking on the one Chinese kid in the entire school and said gook as I patted him on the head. I had no idea why everyone was so mad at me until years later, having seen Full Metal Jacket. I thought I just made a witty cross between goose and duck at its spelling. Story 40. I used to think that a traffic jam was when jam had been spilt on the road and cars had got stuck to it. Good job, my GF told me differently last week. That could have been embarrassing. Story 41. When I was 5 years old, my dog ran away. One night while the dog was still missing, I overheard my mother say the following while cutting a roast. This is one tough puppy. I freaked out. Nothing she said could convince me that she hadn't cooked my beloved dog. Lucky for her, my dog came home that night. Story 42. I always thought it was play it by ear. In my head to this day, I still think it makes more sense than play it by ear. We'll make it up as we go along, second by second, day by day, year by year. We will play it by ear. Story 43. I thought that when people said a clock was fast or slow, that the clock actually counted wrong. I also, until very recently, didn't realize that the name of the condition is astigmatism. I thought it was astigmatism. Story 44. A stitch in time saves 9. For the longest time I read that as a stitch in the space-time continuum saves 9 somethings, and I couldn't understand how Ben Franklin knew about the space-time continuum. Story 45. Mandatory. I thought it was the complete opposite of what it means. I remember having a swim team meeting once when I was about 9 or 10, and my mom asked me if I had to go, it was going to start in about 15 minutes. I said nope, they told us it was mandatory, and I don't feel like going. She was like, what? Story 46. Oh God, this has to do with pronunciation. Worst of all, it wasn't when I was a child. I was junior in high school, and my best friend and I were blowing up toys with M80s, and his dad came out to see us. His dad is extremely smart, dry humor, almost to an evil extent, and a computer engineer. I quite loudly proclaimed, and then something went AWWV. My friend's dad stopped dead in his tracks, and he's like, what did you say? Wait, what word is that? RY? My face went white as all the blood drained from it as I realized I had only read the word awry up to that point and had never heard it pronounced. Somehow, even though it's not a big deal, it stuck tying me as especially traumatic. I think because I said it with so much enthusiasm, as if I knew completely what I was talking about. Story 47. Yesterday at work, The gay guy was singing Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back. When he got to the part of my anaconda, don't want none unless you got buns, hun, I burst out laughing because I always pictured a snake, and then I realized, Story 48, the machine, is out of order always sounded like the machine was out of water. I assumed arcade games and coin-operated candy machines needed water to work. Story 49, heard this the other day, Christmas pageant. Here come the 3 third-grader wise men. Wise man, 1, I bring you gold. Wise man, 3, I bring you myrrh. Wise man, 2 francs sent these. Story 50, I thought oral meant kissing. Once, when our youth pastor for a church youth group or something told us that it was a sin to have before marriage, I tried to sound smart by using proper terms and asked if oral was okay. Story 51, horny. I used to think it actually meant having horns. I knew this techno song that kept repeating, I'm so horny. Horny, horny, horny. I used to sing that song all the time in front of guests and everything, sometimes with my fingers on my head like 2 horns. Story 52, I thought that Kim Jong-il was actually Kim Jong-2, as in the second, because in all the newspapers I read the font in the headline made the I and the L look similar. Story 53, having trouble making ends meet. I just figured that ends meet was a bad cut of beef, and you couldn't even afford that. Ends meet does make a bit more sense. Story 54, mortality and anti-Semitic. I get embarrassed to this day when I think about how I didn't understand these words. I thought mortality was the opposite of what it is, and I thought anti-Semite didn't only deal with Jews. I argued once with an English teacher about the term anti-Semitic, and I touted that the word Semite is about Jewish and Arabic-speaking people, and, as such applies most Middle Easterners. I figured that the term anti-Semite should be as inclusive as Semite, and said that I dislike how it was only used to describe anger hostility toward Jews, but somehow didn't apply all these other people. My English teacher and class just laughed at me and made me feel like a fool. I still think I am right on some level. Story 55, one day my incredibly smart wife was telling me a story, and then a word came out of her mouth that sounded like measled. I was confused for a minute, then worked with the context and said, did you mean misled? She had her own moment of confusion, and then suddenly it clicked. She read a lot as a child, and in her head, the word was pronounced measled. Sure, she knew there was a word misled, but it had never occurred to her that they were the same word, of course. I've never let her hear the end of it. Story 56, pet hates. I remember being very confused by this in an old wrestling annual that had a bio on each character. So Bret Hart doesn't have any pets, but his pet hates say smoking and cheaters. How does his pet that he doesn't have know what cheating is? Confusing. Story 57, prevent. As in only you can prevent forest fires. I had never heard the word before seeing that commercial. I did my best to place the meaning of that word to the context of the commercial. All my little child brain could come up with was prevent start. I thought Smokey the Bear was telling me to start forest fires for a very long time. Story 58, not mine, but my niece's for years. She thought some of the slightly odd kids at her school had a very mysterious syndrome called Asperger's. Story 59, when I read the books, it was Hermione. Then I saw the movie and heard Hermione. I felt relieved as my original interpretation sounded so ugly and the true sound was so melodic. I was in my early 20s at the time. Story 60, when I was small, I used to go to a Catholic church with my parents. There was a song that contained some verse about Jesus gathering the lambs in his arms, leading them home. I always heard gathering the lambs in his arms, eating them whole. That is a pretty significant difference, especially to a small child's mind. Story 61, international. It made sense that international would mean in our nation. Imagine how embarrassed I was at recess the day I found out I was wrong. I was the joke of the class for a couple weeks. The kids called me names, all in good fun, I guess. Children say the darndest things, right? Then my mom left. She couldn't stand to be around such an ignorant son. Then the beating started. Dad was only trying to help. Then he went to heaven so he could be around more intelligent people. I can laugh off my silly misconceptions now, but back then I felt pretty dumb, as you can probably imagine. Haha. In our nation. Can you believe it? Story 62, when I was little, I saw an ad on TV for a painkiller that said it was good for period pain, being a boy of 6 or so. I asked my mother what period pain was. She told me it was like a stomach ache. A few days later, I had a bad stomach ache at school and asked the teacher if I could go to the sick bay. She asked me why. In front of the entire class, I said I have period pain. The laughter, she haunts me to this day. Story 63, I thought the Grand Canyon was the Grand Camion when I was around 5 in French. Camion means truck in French, and Grand Camion, big truck. I was very disappointed when we went there, and there was no truck. Story 64, the F word. My brother came home from school one day and told my mom that a kid in his class got in trouble for using the F word. Not knowing what it was, I asked Mom, what's the F word? Fancy she told me. I couldn't understand what was so bad about that. The next day at daycare, a kid I was sharing the Lego set with was hoarding all the good pieces, and I got very upset. So I said the worst thing I could think of: "You're fancy." Story 65, I would always hear commercials for Circuit City. I thought they were saying Circus City and was always begging my parents to take me. Imagine my disappointment. Story 66, mine is in Spanish. The Bible passage, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you," which is always read at church, translates to Spanish as "Mi paz os te yo," "Mi paz os doy." I always understood "en I pasos te yo," "en I pasos doy," which could be translated as "I leave no mark," "I leave no trace." It was so much better than the original, Ninja Jesus. Story 67, every night before bed. My mom would close my closet door so the draft wouldn't get in. Guess who thought a draft was some sort of creature that vaguely resembled a giraffe, but lived in my closet? Oddly, I have no recollection of being afraid of said draft. Story 68, I thought prosecuted was executed. When flying by on a toll road, my parents would take the lane that required a special device but allowed you to pass without having to stop. There was a sign that said all easy tag users will be prosecuted. Seemed like a pretty harsh punishment to me. Story 69, for the first few years of elementary school, I thought that in the Pledge of Allegiance it was for Richard Stands and not for which it stands. I had no idea who Richard Stands was, but I guess that's blind allegiance for you. Story 70, never went to church. Didn't say prayers in my junior school. Got a fourth year, 8 years old, whatever your local education system uses, and was suddenly expected to recite the Lord's Prayer in assembly every morning. Can you imagine what that's like? Headmaster says, "Let us pray," and then suddenly there's this weird chanting coming from all around you. Everyone has their heads bowed, mindlessly chanting some incomprehensible mumbo-jumbo. For a minute or so, I thought everyone was possessed. There's no double meaning to this post. BTW, whatever anyone thinks of how atheists talk of religion. Story 71, when I was 6 or 7, I would see something on the news where people were robbed at gunpoint. I kept thinking gunpoint was a place. I could never understand why people would go back. It seemed like a guarantee you would be mugged if you went. Story 72, my mom was always into celebrating our ethnic heritage. We had Irish and Scandinavian trinkets decorating the house, and she would always tell me proudly that I am Irish, German, French, Norwegian, and Danish. Needless to say, I am very, very white. When I went to kindergarten, for some reason my teacher was talking to us about race. She told us to raise our hands if we're mixed, and I raised my hand. The teacher looked puzzled, and one of the kids in the back yelled, "No, you're not. I didn't understand. My ancestors are from lots of different countries, yo." Story 73, sucker. My dad was a contractor and always had many tubes of caulk for caulking guns laying around the garage. So when my older cousin first used the term, I thought it meant to caulk from the tube. Hearing worst case scenario and thinking it was worst case scenario and being like, what does the K stand for? Story 74, and the 199 of people get wrong. It is spit and image, meaning biologically or genetically, and in appearance there is no spitting image. It does not make sense. Story 75, I learned no less than a month ago that it is camouflage and not camouflage as I had thought for my whole life. Apparently we aren't trying to be stealthy like camels. Story 76, Howard be thy name. Hallowed be thy name. Thought God's name was Howard Cross-Eyed Bear. Cross-Eyed Bear for all intensive purposes, for all intents and purposes. Story 77, I didn't quite understand that words could have multiple meanings. I remember reading my dad an overdue notice from Blockbuster. I proudly announced that he had an outstanding balance of 2.15 facepalm. Story 78, when someone would sneeze and someone else would say Gesundheit, I thought they were saying Gesundheit, referring to the sound some people make when sneezing. Gesundheit. Story 79, when I was about 10, I thought Family Jewels was Family Jews. When my soccer coach told us to protect our family Jews during penalty kicks where you form that wall, I was confused on a number of levels. Story 80, in Chinese, xie is thank you. Duo means more, and so duo xie means thanks a lot. It means big, so when I was a kid, I used to say to xie thinking that meant thanks a lot. Turns out it means diarrhea. Story 81, my dad used the word oxymoron, and I wanted to use it also. So the first opportunity that came up, I was proud to say, he can't do that. That's a knocky imbecile. I mixed up oxy and knocky and moron and imbecile. My dad thought it was hilarious. Story 82, in elementary school. People would always shout, "Hey, look, there's an elephant in the tree," or some unimaginable thing. Everyone would then turn and look. Made you look? I always heard it as major look and thought it was a look that had a major effect. Story 83, in French. Un amande is an almond, but un amande is a fine. You pronounce them almost the same. I believe that when cops got you over speed, you had to eat an almond because I didn't like that. I thought it was quite unfair because some people like almonds. Story 84. When I was still a bit too young to read everything I called good humor ice cream good Hummer, I would always ask my parents if I could get a good Hummer, to which they replied sure, always while holding back from laughing their asses off. I was at my friend's later on, and when we went to get ice cream, and I was like, oh boy, in getting a good Hummer, my friend's mom started crying. She laughed so hard. When I asked her why she, as well as my parents, thought this was a riot, she told me it was good humor, not Hummer. I didn't want to speak to my parents for a week. I was just a little boy walking around where I could get a good Hummer. Story 85. The stylized used by Disney always threw me as a kid. I thought it was a G and would often ask people if they liked Disney films. Your imagination can probably fill in how I pronounce Disney. Story 86. For some reason, I thought a prostitute was any person in jail. This was back in the late 80s when I was in 6th grade. On Halloween, my 6th grade science teacher wore, as a costume, a black and white striped old-timey prison jumpsuit. Later, when my mom asked if any of my teachers had dressed up for Halloween, I told her that my science teacher went as a prostitute. She was shocked, yelling in a shrill voice, "What?" As I realized something was wrong and started explaining what the costume was, she quickly realized that I meant convict. Naturally, she had to explain next what a prostitute actually is. Story 87. Long-time lurker, first-time poster, waves enthusiastically. This is quite embarrassing now that I think about it. When I was a kid, we used to live in the Middle East, Dubai, before the big construction boom, and every Friday my dad would buy Lebanese sausages to barbecue for brunch. I absolutely love these, think mini cocktail weenies, except juicier and spicier. One day we were in the grocery store on a Friday, and my family and I were walking through the frozen meat section, and my dad asked what I wanted to eat for lunch. So I yell out in a packed aisle full of Arabs and foreigners, "I want lesbian sausages D." I had just heard the word previously on the playground in school and didn't grasp the difference, so imagine the look on all the people's faces around me. Half the people in the aisle were laughing so hard they dropped their grocery baskets and their contents everywhere, while the other folks stood there absolutely shocked. My dad grabbed about 10 packets with tears in his eyes from laughing, and my mom and older sister laughing hysterically. To this day, every time we have a family barbecue, my dad would offer me a few lesbian sausages. TLDR, I blurted out in a pack store that instead of wanting Lebanese sausages, I wanted lesbian sausages. Story 88. I remember learning that a yellow light means wait if you're late. I wondered why you had to stop if you were running late to an appointment. Wouldn't that just make you more late? Story 89. When I was very small, I thought that motels were hotels that advertised that they also supplied a pretty lady motel model. I was also absolutely shocked that you could get condoms at the McDonald's drive-thru. Condom and condom. Story 90. My story is slightly different. When we got special passes to watch an IndyCar race, I asked my dad what VIP stood for. He told me it stood for very important person. I thought he was joking, so I asked what it really meant. I refused to believe him, thinking he was being condescending and withholding the actual meaning. It took asking at least 2 more people in the area before I was convinced. Story 91. Do you mind? When I was maybe 4 to 5 years old, I thought that this meant, do you approve? Which made for a funny situation in which I thought my mom would like a bowl of Cheerios with orange juice instead of milk. Story 92. I learned what meant when I was 10. Later in the week, I was reading about Rome, and how when the Carthaginians saw how outnumbered they were forced to capitulate to the Romans. I didn't know the difference between and capitulate, and had a really weird conversation with my mom asking her about that incident. Story 93. Misdemeanor, particularly the warnings on the doors of convenience stores. It is a crime misdemeanor to consume beer or liquor on these premises, being that I lived near the Mexican border. Everything is printed in both English and Spanish. My child mind somehow thought that one word, misdemeanor, could mean that someone should not consume beer or liquor there. I remember being fascinated about how efficient the Spanish language must be and how so much could be conveyed with just one word. I also thought it was strange that a language would even need a word for don't drink beer or liquor here. Story 94. Words and phrases that are misheard and misunderstood like this are called eggcorns. You can find a motherload of them here. Story 95. I could never get the phrase a stitch in time saves 9. I thought it was a stitch in time saves 9. Rather than a stitch in time saves 9 stitches. I blame Madeline Lingle. Story 96. My coworker slips up on this stuff on the time. Hey, erase the highlights. Automatically. ITLL appear on the screen. Automagically. Specific time. Pacific time. You'll have your laptop shipped by 3 p.m. Specific time. Ergonomic. Yeah, I can help you order a ergonomic keyboard. Kneecaps. Oh man, my kneecaps hurt. Malicious. My favorite BTW. Looks like you've got some malicious software on your system. Story 97. When I was about 6, my buddy from a lower-class family told me on the phone that he couldn't play that day because he was grounded. I was shocked that they would literally bury their child to the neck as a form of punishment. I just thought, well, whatever you crazy hicks. Story 98. I used to say orgasmic instead of organic. When my parents discovered this, they exploited it to full effect at the supermarket by sending me to the assistants to ask, where are the orgasmic carrots? Story 99. When I was a kid, I was convinced the subway literally traveled underwater. Okay, that was one thing, but when I was 6 or so, I rode on the NYC subway for the first time. I kept staring out the window, trying to see fish and see monsters and whales. Couldn't see a thing. Why? Because it's dark? But that day it was wet or something. So when the subway would pull into a station and the doors open, water would drip down. Okay, still looking, staring out the window when we're moving and I can't see any fish, submarines, seahorses, or anything. I kind of give up and I turn away from the window. This bag lady was sitting there. I absolutely kid you not, she looks me straight in the face and says, "See the water?" I stared back at her and quietly nodded in agreement because I didn't want to look like I missed something.